Two high school sweethearts from Vancouver Island climbed into a bronze Ford van on a Wednesday morning in November 1987, planning to make a quick overnight trip to Seattle and be home by Thursday evening. The journey required two ferry crossings and would take them into a foreign country, but the route was straightforward and the errand was simple. Within hours of arriving in Seattle, both would be dead. Their bodies would be found days later in two separate locations 70 miles apart, and the evidence left behind would baffle investigators for 3 decades. The killer moved between multiple crime scenes across 3 counties, leaving deliberate clues that seemed designed to taunt law enforcement. It would take a technology that did not exist in 1987, combined with the voluntary actions of a woman who had no connection to the victims, to finally identify the person responsible. Make sure to subscribe if you want to follow cases where breakthrough science changes everything investigators thought was possible. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18 years old in the autumn of 1987. She had graduated from Oak Bay High School on Vancouver Island that June and was living with her parents in Saanich, British Columbia, while she saved money for a trip to Holland to visit family on her father's side. Tanya was not in a rush to figure out her future career path. She had expressed interest in working with animals and possibly becoming a veterinarian, but for now she was content to stay at home, spend time with her golden retriever named Tessa, and enjoy the freedom that comes after finishing high school. Tanya was an active young woman who sailed with her family on trips around the coastal waters near Victoria. She played guitar casually, and her favorite band was U2, whose album The Joshua Tree had reached #1 earlier that year. She also played tennis, though she acknowledged she was usually overmatched when she faced her older brother John on the court in their backyard. Tanya cared for various pets over the years, including cats, fish, and gerbils, but the golden retriever had been acquired only after persistent appeals to her mother. That summer, Tanya had begun dating Jay Cook. Jay was 20 years old, stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, and was broad-shouldered and left-handed. He had worked on a fishing boat and in a fissa restaurant. He played bass guitar and shared Tanya's family's love of boating around Vancouver Island. The two had been in a relationship for approximately 6 months by November. On November 18, 1987, Jay invited Tanya to accompany him on an overnight trip to Seattle. The purpose was straightforward and business-related. Jay needed to pick up a $750 money order for his father's business from Gensco Heating, an appliance supply store located in Seattle's SoDo district. The plan was to drive to Seattle, sleep overnight in the parking lot outside the store, pick up the money order when the business opened, and drive back to British Columbia the following day. The vehicle they would travel in was Jay's father's bronze 1977 Ford Club Wagon van. The trip required crossing into the United States and taking 2 ferries to reach Seattle. Jay and Tanya left Saanich on the morning of November 18th and drove to Victoria to board the MV Coho ferry bound for Port Angeles, Washington. The ferry crossing took approximately 90 minutes, and they arrived in Port Angeles around 4 in the afternoon. From Port Angeles, Jay drove the van southeast on Route 101 toward Bremerton, where they would board a second ferry to Seattle. During the drive between Port Angeles and Bremerton, they stopped for fuel. A receipt for the fuel purchase was later recovered and confirmed their route. However, Jay missed the exit for the Hood Canal Bridge, which would have been the most direct route to Bremerton. Instead, the van was rerouted through the small community of Allen before continuing on to Bremerton. Jay and Tanya arrived in Bremerton and purchased a ticket for the ferry to Seattle at 10:16 in the evening. The ticket purchase was documented and the physical ticket was later recovered, confirming they had boarded the Bremerton to Seattle ferry. The ferry docked in Seattle before midnight. Jay and Tanya planned to find the parking lot near Gensco Heating in the SoDo district and sleep in the van until morning. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were expected to return to British Columbia on Thursday, November 19, 1987. The trip to Seattle was meant to be a simple overnight errand with a clear timeline. Jay needed to pick up the money order from Gensco Heating when the business opened, and the drive back to Saanich would take several hours, including the 2 ferry crossings. The families on both sides anticipated seeing Jay and Tanya by Thursday evening at the latest. Thursday came and went without any contact from either Jay or Tanya. Neither had called home. Neither had arrived back in Saanich. The families waited through the evening, expecting that perhaps the errand had taken longer than anticipated, or that the young couple had decided to extend their trip slightly. But as the hours passed without a phone call or any explanation, concern began to build among parents who knew their children's habits and patterns of communication. Tanya's older brother, John Van Cuylenborg, was away at college when he received a call from his father. John's father explained that Tanya and Jay had not returned home as planned and had not made contact with either family. The complete silence from both young people simultaneously was uncharacteristic and deeply troubling. Tanya was not someone who would simply go off without informing her parents of a change in plans. If she and Jay had decided to spend another night in Seattle, or if anything had delayed their return, she would have called. On Friday, November 20th, both families reported Jay and Tanya as missing to law enforcement. The report triggered an official response from authorities in both Canada and Washington state. Police began looking for the bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon van and for any sign of the two young people who had last been seen boarding a ferry in Bremerton 2 nights earlier. John Van Cuylenborg and his father traveled to Seattle to join the search effort. The families could not simply wait in British Columbia while Jay and Tanya remained unaccounted for in a different country. John and his father arrived in the Seattle area and began working with law enforcement to try to locate the missing couple. They checked hospitals, contacted police stations, and explored any logical explanation that might account for the silence. The most innocent explanations began to disappear as the search continued. If Jay and Tanya had been in a car accident, hospitals would have records. If they had experienced mechanical trouble with the van, they would have found a way to call for help or assistance. If they had simply decided to extend their trip for personal reasons, the complete absence of contact with both sets of parents made no sense given what the families knew about Jay and Tanya's character and communication habits. The van had not been located. Jay and Tanya had not been found at any hospital or medical facility. No one had seen them or reported contact with them since the ferry docking in Seattle before midnight on Wednesday. The families faced a situation where every passing hour eliminated another possible explanation and replaced it with growing dread. John Van Cuylenborg later described the feeling during those days of searching as a process of watching innocent possibilities vanish one by one. Something was gravely wrong. The obvious scenarios that might explain a short delay or a missed phone call were no longer plausible. Jay and Tanya had disappeared completely, and neither law enforcement nor the families had any leads pointing toward where they might be or what had happened to them. On Tuesday, November 24, 1987, 6 days after Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had disappeared, a passerby traveling along a rural road in Skagit County made a discovery that would transform the missing persons investigation into a murder case. The location was Parson Creek Road, a wooded drive between Old Highway 99 and Prairie Road near the small community of Alger. The area was approximately 80 miles north of Seattle, far from the Soto district where Jay and Tanya had planned to sleep in their van. Tanya Van Cuylenborg's body was found at the bottom of a ditch alongside the rural road. She had been shot in the back of the head at close range with a .380 caliber firearm. The manner of death was immediately apparent as a homicide. Law enforcement from Skagit County responded to the scene and began processing the evidence. Investigators documented the crime scene and collected physical evidence. White plastic zip ties were found near the body. The location was isolated and wooded, chosen by someone who wanted the body to be concealed from casual view, but who had not made significant efforts to bury or completely hide it. The execution-style shooting suggested a quick killing rather than a prolonged attack at that location. The body was transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The examination confirmed the cause of death as the gunshot wound to the head. The autopsy also documented evidence that would become central to the investigation, including biological material that would later be tested for DNA. Charges relating to assault were documented based on the medical evidence, though the complete details of those findings were not released publicly at the time. John Van Cuylenborg received notification that his sister's body had been identified. He had been searching for Tanya in the Seattle area alongside his father, and had been clinging to diminishing hope that she might still be found alive. The confirmation that Tanya had been killed transformed that hope into a crushing reality. that John would later describe as one of the most horrific moments of his life. John was asked to formally identify his sister's body. The experience of seeing Tanya lying on an examination table, knowing the violent circumstances of her death, left him devastated. The identification process was necessary for the investigation to move forward, but represented an ordeal that no family member should have to endure. John completed the identification and confirmed to authorities that the body was that of his 18-year-old sister. Even with Tanya's body found and identified, critical questions remained completely unanswered. Jay Cook was still missing. The bronze Ford van had not been located. The families had no information about how Tanya had ended up 80 miles north of Seattle when the couple had planned to stay near the Soto district. The method by which Tanya and Jay had been separated, the sequence of events that led to her death, and the location of Jay remained unknown. The Skagit County Sheriff's Office began working the homicide investigation while authorities in Snohomish County and other jurisdictions continued searching for Jay Cook. The discovery of Tanya's body indicated that whatever had happened to the young couple had involved extreme violence. The use of a firearm, the isolated location, and the evidence collected at the scene all pointed toward a deliberate and planned killing, rather than a crime of opportunity or a situation that had escalated from something less serious. The Van Cuylenborg family faced the unbearable grief of losing Tanya, while simultaneously dealing with continued uncertainty about Jay's fate. The two families had maintained hope that both young people might be found safe, or at minimum that they might be found together. The discovery of Tanya's body alone, with Jay still unaccounted for, created a situation where one family's worst fears had been confirmed, while another family remained in agonizing suspense. Law enforcement officials began examining the evidence collected from the crime scene to determine if there were any leads that might point toward a suspect. The investigation had transitioned from a missing persons case involving two individuals to a confirmed homicide with one victim identified and a second person still missing under circumstances that suggested he had also been killed. On November 25, 1987, the day after Tanya Van Cuylenborg's body was found in Skagit County, investigators made additional discoveries that would provide crucial evidence while simultaneously deepening the mystery of what had happened to Jay Cook and Tanya. The new findings came from Bellingham, a city in Whatcom County located approximately 16 miles from where Tanya's body had been discovered. A collection of items was found discarded under the porch of a local tavern called Essie's Tavern in downtown Bellingham. The tavern was located next to the Greyhound bus station, a detail that would become significant to investigators trying to understand the movements of whoever had killed Tanya. The items found under the porch included Tanya's wallet, the keys to the Ford van, a box of .380 caliber ammunition, white plastic zip ties, and a surgical glove. The ammunition was examined and determined to match the bullet that had killed Tanya Van Cuylenborg. The presence of the surgical glove suggested that the person who had left these items was attempting to avoid leaving fingerprints or other identifiable traces. The location of the discarded items near a Greyhound bus station raised a possibility that the perpetrator had used public transportation to leave the area after disposing of evidence. The same day, investigators located the bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon van in a parking lot in downtown Bellingham. The van was found just a few blocks away from where the items had been discarded under the porch of Essie's Tavern. The tavern was locked when officers found it. Inside the van, investigators discovered evidence that would prove critical to eventually solving the case decades later. White plastic zip ties were found inside the van, matching the zip ties that had been found near Tanya's body and under the porch of the tavern. Plastic gloves were found in plain view inside the vehicle. Detective Robert Guibo of the Seattle Police Department later noted that the placement of the gloves appeared deliberate, as if the killer was sending a message to law enforcement. The gloves seemed to be saying that there was no point in looking for fingerprints because the perpetrator had been careful to wear protection. The confidence displayed by leaving such obvious clues suggested someone who believed they would not be caught. A blood-stained comforter was found inside the van. The blood patterns and location of the comforter provided information about where violence had likely occurred. A palm print was discovered on the back of the van, raising hopes among investigators that the print might belong to the perpetrator and could eventually be matched to a suspect. The most significant piece of evidence found inside the van was a pair of black pants that had belonged to Tanya Van Cuylenborg. The pants were examined by forensic scientists who determined that semen was present on the fabric. The biological material was tested and the DNA profile was compared against Jay Cook's DNA. The profile did not match Jay, which meant the DNA belonged to someone else. Investigators designated this unknown DNA profile as Individual A. The same DNA profile was later found to match biological material recovered during Tanya's autopsy, confirming that Individual A was connected to the crimes against her. Also found inside the van was the unused $750 money order that Jay had traveled to Seattle to pick up. The money order remained in the vehicle, indicating that robbery had not been the motive for the killings. Whatever had motivated the perpetrator to kill Jay and Tanya, it was not financial gain from taking the money order that Jay's father's business needed. Several items that should have been in the van were missing. Tanya had brought a Minolta X 735mm camera on the trip. The camera had a specific serial number, 2067048, which investigators documented. The camera was not in the van and was never recovered intact. In 1990, the lens from the camera was traced to a pawn shop in Portland, Oregon, but the camera body was never found. Also missing from the van were a ski jacket and a backpack that had belonged to Jay and Tanya. The evidence from Bellingham provided investigators with multiple crime scenes to process. Tanya's body had been found off Parson Creek Road in Skagit County. The items under the porch of Essie's Tavern represented a second location where the perpetrator had been present. The van in the parking lot was a third scene that contained extensive physical evidence. All three locations were connected by the presence of white plastic zip ties, creating a clear link between the different sites. Jay Cook remained missing. His body had not been found with Tanya's, had not been discovered in Bellingham, and was not in the van. The families continued to wait for information about what had happened to him, even as the evidence mounted that he had almost certainly been killed. The manner in which the crimes had been carried out, with bodies and evidence scattered across multiple locations in different counties, suggested a perpetrator who was either familiar with the area or who had carefully planned how to distribute evidence across jurisdictions to complicate the investigation. On November 26, 1987, Thanksgiving Day, a pheasant hunter was walking through an area near the Snohomish River in Snohomish County when his dog made a discovery. The location was along Crescent Lake Road near High Bridge Road, an area characterized by tall grass and rural landscape. The dog uncovered what the hunter initially could not identify, prompting a closer examination that revealed human remains concealed beneath a blue blanket. Law enforcement from Snohomish County responded to the scene. The body was identified as Jay Cook. He had been found approximately 70 miles south of where Tanya Van Cuylenborg's body had been discovered 2 days earlier. The significant distance between the two locations indicated that the perpetrator had transported the victims to separate areas, either simultaneously or in sequence, and had chosen distinctly different dump sites for each body. The cause of Jay's death was determined through examination at the scene and subsequent autopsy. He had been beaten with rocks. He had been strangled to death using twine that had been tied to dog collars, creating an improvised ligature. The violence inflicted on Jay was extensive and brutal, suggesting a prolonged attack rather than a quick execution like the one that had killed Tanya. Additional evidence was found at the scene that demonstrated the perpetrator's deliberate cruelty. Tissue and a pack of Camel Light cigarettes had been stuffed down Jay's throat. The act served no practical purpose for the killer, but appeared designed to degrade the victim or send some kind of message. The blue blanket covering the body did not belong to either Jay or Tanya, and neither family had seen it before. The blanket represented another piece of evidence that had been brought to the scene by the perpetrator. White plastic zip ties were found near Jay's body, matching the zip ties discovered at the other crime scenes. The ties had been found near Tanya's body in Skagit County, under the porch of the tavern in Bellingham, and inside the van. The presence of identical zip ties at all locations provided the clearest physical link between the different crime scenes and confirmed that the same person was responsible for both murders. Detective Jim Scharf of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office would later describe the scene where Jay was found as horrible. The level of violence and the manner in which the body had been left indicated a perpetrator who was not simply trying to eliminate witnesses or cover up another crime. The brutality suggested someone who derived satisfaction from the act of killing, or who had a specific reason for the extreme violence directed at both victims. The Cook family received confirmation that Jay had been killed. Both families now faced the reality that Jay and Tanya were gone. The young couple who had left British Columbia on what should have been a routine overnight trip had both been murdered within hours of arriving in Seattle. The two families who had held out hope during the days of searching now had to process the loss of their children under the worst possible circumstances. Investigators now had 4 distinct crime scenes to examine across 3 counties. Tanya's body had been found in Skagit County. The items under the tavern porch and the van were both in Bellingham in Whatcom County. Jay's body was in Snohomish County. The perpetrator had moved between these locations, leaving evidence at each site while successfully avoiding detection during the commission of the crimes. The coordination required to manage multiple crime scenes suggested someone who was organized, mobile, and confident that they could operate across jurisdictions without being caught. Investigators working the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg faced a complicated forensic puzzle spread across 4 crime scenes in 3 separate counties. The white plastic zip ties found at each location provided the clearest physical connection between the sites. The ties appeared to be part of what investigators believed was a rape murder kit, suggesting the perpetrator had come prepared with tools designed to restrain and control victims. The DNA evidence collected from the semen on Tanya's pants represented the strongest lead available to investigators. The profile, dubbed Individual A, did not match Jay Cook, confirming it belonged to someone else. The same DNA profile was found in biological material recovered during Tanya's autopsy, establishing that Individual A was directly connected to the crimes committed against her. However, in 1987, DNA technology in criminal investigations was still relatively new, and databases for comparison were limited. The case generated tips and theories from the beginning. The Van Cuylenborg family offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible for the murders. The substantial reward brought in numerous tips, but none resulted in identifying a viable suspect. In December 1987, just weeks after the murders, both families began receiving disturbing letters in the mail. An anonymous writer sent multiple letters claiming to be the person who had killed Jay and Tanya. The letters contained graphic descriptions of the murders and were clearly designed to torment the grieving families. The correspondence bore postmarks from different cities, including Seattle, Los Angeles, and New York, indicating the writer was either traveling or attempting to disguise their location. In 2010, more than 2 decades after the letters first arrived, investigators located the person who had written them. The writer was a 78-year-old Canadian transient who had mental health issues. After extensive investigation and interviews, authorities determined conclusively that the letter writer had no connection to the actual murders. The man had read about the crimes, and for reasons related to his mental illness, had fixated on the case and decided to send the threatening correspondence. He was cleared as a suspect in the killings. In 1995, Detective Jim Scharf of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office helped form a dedicated cold case team. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were among the first cases the team took on. Scharf later described the double murder as probably the most horrendous unsolved case the county had on its books. Detective Scharf became deeply invested in solving the case. Over the years, more than 200 names came across his desk as potential suspects or persons of interest. Each name required investigation, interviews, and often DNA testing if the individual could be located and samples could be obtained. Some of the names belonged to convicted felons. Others were individuals who had been in the area at the time and had raised suspicion for various reasons. One suspect who received significant attention was Charles Sinclair, who was believed by some investigators to be a serial killer operating across the western United States. Sinclair was investigated thoroughly in connection with Jay and Tanya's murders, but ultimately he was eliminated as a suspect. His DNA did not match Individual A, and there was no evidence connecting him to the crime scenes. In 2003, forensic scientist Lisa Collins of the Washington State Patrol uploaded the Individual A DNA profile to CODIS, the FBI's National Offender Database. CODIS contained DNA profiles from convicted criminals and from unsolved crime scenes across the country. The upload represented hope that Individual A might match someone already in the system. The database search came back with no hits. As years passed, the profile remained in CODIS and was automatically compared against new entries added to the database, but complete silence followed. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office created a deck of playing cards featuring cold cases that they distributed to inmates in county jails and state prisons. The strategy was based on the theory that inmates might have information about unsolved crimes or might know someone who had been involved. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were featured on the King of Hearts card, a designation that highlighted the prominence of their case among the county's unsolved murders. Detective Robert Jebbo of the Seattle Police Department made observations about the evidence that suggested the killer's mindset. Jebbo noted that the plastic gloves left in plain view inside the van appeared to be a deliberate message to law enforcement. The placement seemed to communicate that there was no point in looking for fingerprints because the perpetrator had worn protection. The confidence displayed by leaving such obvious clues suggested someone who believed they would not be caught. Collins later reflected on the years of waiting for a CODIS match with a sense of discouragement. As years went by without any progress, there was a genuine fear that the case might never be solved. The technology existed to identify individual A if that person's DNA ever entered the database, but without a match, the profile would remain unmatched indefinitely. In 2017, Detective Jim Scharf learned about an innovative forensic tool developed by Parabon Nanolabs, a DNA technology company based in Virginia. The tool was called snapshot phenotyping, and it used DNA evidence to predict the genetic traits of an unknown suspect. The process analyzed genetic markers in a DNA sample to create predictions about physical characteristics, including facial features, skin tone, eye color, and hair color. Scharf contacted Paragon Nanolabs and arranged for the individual A DNA profile to be analyzed using snapshot phenotyping. The company gathered the genetic information from the DNA sample and created composite sketches showing what the suspect might look like at different ages. Paragon produced 3 versions of the composite, one showing the suspect at approximately age 25, another at age 45, and a third at age 65. The composites gave Scharf visual representations to work with, but they still did not provide what he needed most, which was an actual name. The composite sketches were released to the public in April 2018. Law enforcement hoped that someone might recognize the person depicted in the images and come forward with information. The sketches represented the best physical description investigators had been able to develop of the suspect in the 3 decades since the murders. However, without a name attached to the face, the composites alone were not enough to move the investigation to an arrest. On April 25, 2018, news broke of a stunning arrest in California that would change the trajectory of cold case investigations across the country. Joseph James DeAngelo, known as the Golden State Killer, had been apprehended after evading law enforcement for 43 years. DeAngelo was responsible for numerous rapes and murders committed across California during the 1970s and 1980s. His crimes had terrorized communities for years, and despite extensive investigations, he had never been identified as a suspect. The method used to identify DeAngelo represented a completely new approach to solving cold cases. Investigators had used a technique called genetic genealogy, which combined DNA testing with traditional genealogical research methods. The process involved uploading crime scene DNA to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy website where users voluntarily share their DNA information to explore family connections and build family trees. The DNA uploaded to GEDmatch was compared against the profiles of people who had submitted their own genetic information to the site. The comparison identified individuals who shared segments of DNA with the unknown suspect, indicating they were biological relatives, even if the relationship was distant. Genealogists then built family trees using the DNA matches as starting points, working backward through generations to find common ancestors and then forward again to identify all descendants of those ancestors. The process eventually narrowed the suspect pool to Joseph James DeAngelo, whose DNA was then directly tested and matched to crime scene evidence. When Detective Scharf heard about the Golden State Killer arrest and the genetic genealogy method used to identify DeAngelo, the implications for his own investigation were immediately clear. Scharf later described the moment as a big light bulb going off in his head. The same technique that had identified the Golden State Killer after more than 4 decades could potentially be applied to the individual A DNA profile from the J. Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg murders. Scharf contacted Parabon Nanolabs and discussed the possibility of using genetic genealogy on his case. His response to learning about the new investigative tool was direct and enthusiastic. He told colleagues that the development was fantastic and that he needed to get on it immediately. The technology represented the first real breakthrough in investigative capability since the case had gone cold. Parabon agreed to take on the case. The company would upload the individual A DNA profile to GEDmatch and search for relatives who had voluntarily submitted their DNA to the public database. If matches were found, genealogists would attempt to build family trees and identify the person whose DNA matched the crime scene evidence. The process had worked for the Golden State Killer case, and there was reason to hope it might work for the murders of Jay and Tanya as well. The decision to pursue genetic genealogy represented a significant shift in how the investigation would proceed. For 3 decades, the case had relied on traditional investigative methods, including witness interviews, suspect elimination through DNA testing, and waiting for a CODIS database match that never came. Genetic genealogy offered a way to use the DNA evidence proactively by comparing it against a completely different type of database, one populated by ordinary citizens exploring their ancestry rather than by convicted criminals required to submit samples. On Friday, April 27, 2018, Parabon Nanolabs uploaded the individual AADNA profile to GEDmatch. The digital file containing the genetic information from the crime scene evidence was now in the database, ready to be compared against the DNA profiles of users who had voluntarily submitted their information to explore family connections. The comparison process would search for segments of identical DNA shared between individual A and people in the database, with longer shared segments indicating closer biological relationships. Parabon called in genetic genealogist C.C. Moore to work on the case. Moore was known for her expertise in building family trees and her work on the PBS television series Finding Your Roots. However, the J. Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg investigation would be her first criminal case using genetic genealogy. The decision to take on the case was not easy for Moore, who had doubts about whether working on criminal investigations was the right direction for her career. She ultimately decided to proceed, but acknowledged that a lot was riding on the outcome. Moore had a personal connection to the case that made it particularly meaningful to her. Her parents were from the Pacific Northwest, and she was the same age as Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Tanya had been killed in November 1987, right when Moore was graduating from high school and heading to college. Moore's life was just beginning at the same time Tanya's ended tragically. The DNA file was uploaded to GEDmatch on Friday evening. Moore stayed up late that night checking repeatedly to see if the system had generated a list of DNA matches. Sometimes the match list appeared immediately after an upload, and sometimes it took a couple of days. On Friday night, no matches appeared. On Saturday morning, April 28, 2018, Moore logged into GEDmatch to check if a match list had been generated overnight. The list was there. Moore examined the results to see what level of relationship the top matches represented. The goal in genetic genealogy investigations was to find at least a second cousin match or closer at the top of the list. Moore and her colleagues referred to finding second cousin matches as being struck by lightning, because such close matches were relatively rare in public databases. In the J. Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg case, Moore was struck by lightning twice. At the top of the match list were 2 people who each shared enough DNA with individual A to be his second cousins. The presence of 2 second cousin matches in the database was an extraordinary stroke of luck. Moore later described the moment of seeing those matches as both exciting and scary, recognizing the responsibility that came with the information. The 2 second cousins shared DNA with individual A but not with each other. This meant they were related to the suspect on different branches of his family tree. One cousin was connected through one side of individual A's family, and the other cousin was connected through a different side. To identify individual A, Moore first needed to determine who these 2 cousins were, and then build out their family trees to find where the branches converged. One of the people at the top of the match list had a distinctive name that made identification straightforward. Her name was Chelsea Rustad. Rustad lived in Tumwater, Washington, and had taken an ancestry DNA test to explore her family history. She had downloaded her raw DNA file from Ancestry and uploaded it to GED Match, which allowed her genetic information to be compared against a broader pool of users from different DNA testing companies. Rustad had done this simply to find other branches of her family tree and had no idea that her DNA would eventually play a role in a murder investigation. Moore was also able to identify the second person at the top of the match list, though that individual has chosen to remain anonymous. With both second cousins identified, Moore began the detailed work of building their family trees. She used traditional genealogical research methods, including birth records, marriage certificates, death records, and census data, to trace each person's ancestry backward through generations. The goal was to find the common ancestors that each cousin shared with individual A, and then map out all the descendants of those ancestors. The process involved constructing comprehensive family trees that included hundreds of individuals across multiple generations. Moore worked methodically through the genealogical records, verifying relationships and tracking families as they moved across different locations over time. The two family trees eventually converged. Moore identified the point where the separate branches of individual A's family came together. The convergence occurred in the marriage of a couple who had lived in Woodinville, Washington. The couple had only one son. Moore believed that son was individual A, the person whose DNA had been left at the crime scene in 1987. The entire process, from the moment Moore logged into GED Match on Saturday morning to the moment she identified the suspected killer, took 2 hours. A case that had eluded investigators for 31 years had been narrowed to a single suspect in the time it takes to watch a movie. Moore was very sure of her identification, but she also recognized the weight of that certainty. At that moment, she was the only person in the world besides the killer who knew his likely identity, and the information she provided could result in that person spending the rest of his life in prison. On Monday morning, April 30th, 2018, Detective Jim Scharf received the news. The suspect had been identified. His name was William Earl Talbot II. Detective Jim Scharf received the name William Earl Talbot II from C.C. Moore on Monday, April 30th, 2018. Scharf's first reaction was disbelief that the investigation had been narrowed to a single suspect so quickly. The genetic genealogy work had provided a name, but now law enforcement needed to confirm that the person identified through family tree research was actually the person whose DNA matched the crime scene evidence. Before approaching Talbot or alerting him in any way, investigators needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from him. If they contacted him directly and requested a voluntary sample, they risked alerting a potential killer who might flee or destroy evidence. The legal method available to obtain DNA without Talbot's knowledge was through discarded items. Under established legal principles, items that people throw away and place in trash for collection are considered abandoned property, and law enforcement can collect such items without a warrant. Investigators began surveillance on William Talbot. They learned that he was 55 years old and worked as a truck driver based in SeaTac, Washington. Talbot would have been 24 years old in November 1987 when Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were murdered. Detectives followed Talbot on his trucking routes for several days, waiting for an opportunity to retrieve something he discarded that could provide a DNA sample. On May 8, 2018, the surveillance team observed Talbot drop a paper coffee cup from his truck. The team immediately retrieved the cup, documenting the chain of custody to preserve it as evidence. The cup was rushed to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory that same day. Forensic scientists needed to extract DNA from the cup and compare it to the individual A profile. Forensic scientist Lisa Collins performed the DNA analysis on the sample from the coffee cup. On May 9, 2018, Collins confirmed that the DNA profile from Talbot's cup matched the individual A profile from the crime scene evidence. The match was definitive. The person who had left biological evidence at the crime scenes in 1987 was William Earl Talbot II. Collins contacted Detective Scharf to inform him of the match. Scharf became emotional upon receiving the news, getting tears in his eyes after 30 decades of working to identify the killer. The confirmation meant that the investigation could finally move from trying to identify a suspect to building a case for arrest and prosecution. On the evening of May 17, 2018, At approximately 6 p.m., Detective Jim Scharf personally arrested William Earl Talbot II in Seattle. Talbot was returning from one of his trucking routes when Scharf placed him in handcuffs. At the same time, investigators from the Snohomish County and Skagit County Sheriff's offices scattered across the region to the homes of Talbot's family members. The coordinated visits were designed to interview family members before anyone else could contact them or influence their statements. Talbot was booked into the Snohomish County Jail on one count of first-degree murder for the killing of Tanya Van Cuylenborg on a warrant issued by Skagit County. Detectives indicated they were continuing to gather evidence related to Jay Cook's murder and anticipated additional charges would follow. Research into Talbot's background revealed he had a criminal history. In 1985, Talbot had been convicted of a misdemeanor assault and was required to seek anger management counseling. In 1986, he skipped court dates. In 1988, he was booked into jail for an overdue fine of $240 that he eventually paid off. Investigators also discovered that in 1987, Talbot had been living at his parents' residence near Woodinville, Washington. The residence was located approximately 7 miles from where Jay Cook's body had been found, under the bridge near the Snoqualmie River. The proximity suggested Talbot had familiarity with the area where he dumped Jay's body. The first person Detective Scharf called after the arrest was John Van Cuylenborg, Tanya's older brother. John had been searching for answers about his sister's murder for more than 30 years. The news that a suspect had been arrested and charged brought a measure of closure to a family that had waited decades for justice. On May 18, 2018, law enforcement held a press conference to announce the arrest. Snohomish County Sheriff Ty Trenery told reporters that they had never given up hope of finding Jay and Tanya's killer. He noted that the arrest demonstrated how powerful it could be to combine new DNA technology with the relentless determination of detectives. Skagit County Sheriff Will Reichart stated that after 31 years, they were one step closer to justice. Talbot made his first court appearance on Friday afternoon after his arrest. He pled not guilty to the charges and was held on $2 million bail. The high bail amount reflected the severity of the charges and the fact that Talbot had evaded detection for more than 30 decades. Chelsea Rustad, whose DNA in the GED match database had helped identify Talbot, was visited at her home by investigators. They informed her that they were investigating a family member of hers for murder, specifically a double homicide from 1987. Rustad was shocked to learn that her voluntary submission of DNA for genealogical purposes had played a role in identifying someone in her extended family tree as a suspected killer. On June 11, 2019, William Earl Talbot II went to trial in Snohomish County Superior Court. The trial was held before Judge Linda Crease and represented a landmark moment in American criminal justice. Talbot was the first defendant identified through genetic genealogy to face a jury trial, and the proceedings would test whether evidence obtained through this new investigative technique could withstand legal scrutiny and result in a conviction. Talbot had pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. His defense team consisted of attorneys Rachel Ford and John Scott. The prosecution was led by prosecutor Matt Baldock. The jury was composed of 7 women and 5 men who would hear evidence and determine whether the state had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that William Talbot had killed Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg in November 1987. The defense strategy centered on challenging the interpretation of the DNA evidence and the circumstances under which it was left. Attorney Rachel Ford argued that the biological evidence found on Tanya Van Cuylenborg's pants and body could be explained by consensual contact rather than assault. The defense suggested that Tanya might have had a consensual encounter with Calvert at some point, and that the DNA evidence alone did not prove he had killed her or Jay Cook. Defense attorney John Scott reinforced the argument that there was insufficient evidence to prove Talbot guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense acknowledged that Talbot's DNA had been found at the crime scene, but argued that the presence of DNA did not definitively establish that he was the person who committed the murders. The defense needed to create enough doubt in the minds of jurors to prevent a unanimous guilty verdict. Prosecutor Matt Baldock presented the state's case methodically. The DNA evidence found on Tanya's pants and recovered during her autopsy matched William Talbot's profile. The DNA match was not in dispute. What the prosecution needed to establish was that the totality of the evidence pointed to Talbot as the killer, rather than someone who had simply had contact with Tanya at some earlier time. Baldock presented evidence about Talbot's residence in 1987. Talbot had been living at his parents' home near Woodinville, approximately 7 miles from where Jay Cook's body was found, under the bridge near the Snoqualmie River. The proximity suggested Talbot had familiarity with the area and could have easily transported Jay's body to that location. The prosecution emphasized the white plastic zip ties found at all 4 crime scenes. Zip ties had been found near Tanya's body in Skagit County, under the porch of the tavern in Bellingham, inside the van in Bellingham, and near Jay's body in Snohomish County. The consistent presence of the zip ties at every location connected to the crimes demonstrated that a single person was responsible for both murders and had moved between multiple locations while carrying tools used to restrain victims. The jury heard testimony about the manner in which Jay and Tanya were killed. Tanya had been shot in the back of the head with a .380 caliber firearm. Jay had been beaten with rocks, strangled with twine tied to dog collars, and had tissue and cigarettes stuffed down his throat. The different methods used to kill each victim suggested the murders had been committed by someone capable of extreme violence and willing to inflict prolonged suffering. Prosecutors also presented evidence about the timeline of the crimes. Jay and Tanya were last seen boarding the ferry from Bremerton to Seattle on the evening of November 18, 1987. The ferry docked before midnight. Jurors who spoke to media after the trial indicated they believed the killings most likely occurred within approximately 8 hours after the couple arrived in Seattle, meaning they were killed in the early morning hours of November 19. The trial lasted through the end of June. Both sides presented their closing arguments, summarizing the evidence and asking the jury to reach conclusions favorable to their positions. The defense maintained that reasonable doubt existed because the DNA evidence alone could not prove murder. The prosecution argued that the combination of DNA evidence, the physical proximity of Talbot's residence to one crime scene, and the zip ties connecting all 4 locations, proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Talbot was responsible for the murders. On June 28, 2019, the jury returned its verdict. William Earl Talbot II was found guilty on both counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The jury unanimously agreed that the state had proven Talbot killed both Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg in November 1987. The verdict made Talbot the first person identified through genetic genealogy to be convicted by a jury trial, establishing a precedent for how such evidence could be used in criminal prosecutions. The conviction brought a measure of resolution to the families who had waited more than 31 years for justice. John Van Cuylenborg and other family members had attended the trial proceedings and heard the evidence presented against Talbot. The guilty verdict confirmed what investigators had believed since the DNA match was confirmed, that William Talbot was the person who had killed the 2 young people from British Columbia during what should have been a simple overnight trip to Seattle. On July 24, 2019, William Earl Talbot II appeared before Judge Linda Crease for sentencing. The conviction on 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder carried serious consequences under Washington state law. At the time of Talbot's arrest in May 2018, the state allowed 2 possible sentences for aggravated first-degree murder: life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. However, while Talbot awaited trial, the Washington State Supreme Court effectively abolished the death penalty, leaving only one sentencing option available. Judge Crease sentenced Talbot to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The consecutive structure meant Talbot would serve 1 life sentence for the murder of Tanya Van Cuylenborg and a second life sentence for the murder of Jay Cook, with no opportunity for release. The sentence ensured Talbot would spend the remainder of his life in custody. Before the sentence was imposed, family members of Jay and Tanya were given the opportunity to address the court through victim impact statements. John Van Cuylenborg, Tanya's older brother, submitted a written statement to the judge, describing the devastating effect his sister's murder had on the family. John wrote that his parents were never the same after Tanya's death. After a few years, they were able to put on a facade most days that they were continuing on, but it did not take much to scratch through their thin veneer to expose their raw pain and lack of will to carry on. John also described how the murder affected his own life for years. He wrote that he could not enjoy music or movies because happiness seemed like a betrayal of his sister's memory. The guilt of surviving when Tanya had been killed created a burden that took years to process and overcome. Mae Robson, Tanya's best friend from high school, also submitted a letter to the judge. Robson wrote that the sentence brought a kind of satisfaction, but that was all she had. She stated that the sorrow would remain in her heart for the rest of her life, and that she missed her friend Tanya. The statement captured the reality that while legal accountability had been achieved, the loss itself could never be undone or repaired. Talbot was given an opportunity to address the court before sentencing. He told Judge Crease that the level of violence in the crimes was something he could not comprehend. He stated that he had gone all his life as a very passive person. Talbot maintained his innocence despite the jury's guilty verdict and the DNA evidence that had led to his identification and arrest. His statement to the court represented his only public comment about the crimes. The resolution of the case through genetic genealogy attracted significant attention from law enforcement agencies across the country. Since the arrest of the Golden State Killer in April 2018 and Talbot's arrest in May 2018, dozens of suspects had been arrested in cold cases using the same technique. The method had proven effective at solving murders and assaults that had remained unsolved for decades, because traditional investigative approaches had failed to identify suspects. The use of genetic genealogy also raised concerns among privacy advocates. The technique relied on people voluntarily uploading their DNA to public databases for genealogical research, and those individuals had not necessarily anticipated that their genetic information might be used by law enforcement to investigate crimes committed by distant relatives. The debate over the appropriate use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations continued even as more cases were solved using the method. On December 7, 2021, more than 2 years after Talbot was sentenced, a Washington appellate court overturned his conviction. The court ruled that juror bias had affected the trial and that the conviction could not stand. The decision meant that prosecutors would need to retry Talbot if they wanted to pursue a conviction. The families who had waited more than 30 years for justice now faced the possibility of going through another trial. However, on December 22, 2022, the Washington State Supreme Court reinstated Talbot's guilty verdict. The Supreme Court examined the appellate court's reasoning and determined that the defense had possessed peremptory challenges during jury selection that would have allowed them to dismiss the juror in question. But the defense had chosen not to use those challenges. Because the defense had the opportunity to remove the juror and did not do so, the Supreme Court ruled that the conviction should stand. William Earl Talbot II remains in custody, serving his 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The case stands as a landmark example of how genetic genealogy transformed cold case investigations and brought resolution to families who had waited decades for answers. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, which occurred in 1987 and remained unsolved for 31 years, were solved through a combination of preserved DNA evidence, advances in forensic technology, the voluntary actions of people exploring their family histories, and the persistence of investigators who never stopped working to identify the person responsible.